good. They do an excellent job, just like you can compare it to the States or Western Europe. And I think it's one of the safer places you can actually fly.
First of all, the standard is the same. I like to believe slightly better. The standard is very high. It's monitored internationally, so it's something you can't take shortcuts on.
South African air traffic control is equivalent to any Western country, Europe or America, in terms of efficiency, in terms of providing the service that the air transport network needs. There's a big difference between South Africa and the rest of Africa. If you take a worst case country, Zaire, I think in my experience has been perhaps the worst. Not so bad as Zaire is Mozambique. I haven't visited Angola, so I can't comment on it. But it's not just simply a question of flying into the countries and dealing with the air traffic controllers. Air traffic control involves a lot more things. It involves search and rescue, for instance. It involves the obtaining of clearances, special clearances to fly into those countries. And very often, whilst you may have a problem communicating with air traffic controllers, to obtain a clearance from a country, say, like Tanzania, can be a 2-week exercise. To make it worse, very often within individual countries, airports can't communicate with each other. Their telex machines don't work, their HF radios don't work, so they just can't pass on information. And what compounds the issue is that you might have a clearance from one of these countries, and if you don't have that in writing, or if the airport itself hasn't been notified, there's a very real danger that those countries will simply put you in jail and lock you up, simply because they haven't heard from their Department of Transport. The pilots approaching the airports have problems with radio equipment. I believe that actually the instrument landing system, if the pilot followed it, would place him 200 meters before the end of the runway. So a lot of local knowledge is required. And very often in these countries, pilots tend to largely ignore what air traffic controllers are telling them, and they communicate amongst themselves.
It's quite often said that, pilots should accept danger pay to fly over Africa because of the ridiculous situation that they're faced with.
I think a classic situation was the Air Force Shackleton accident in, I think, the Mauritanian desert. And it was interesting to see that out of the aircraft that responded to that search and rescue call, I think the first one to get on the scene was a French Navy Atlantique. I think the United Nations sent in a helicopter to pick the crew up, and there was virtually no facility that the country itself provided. De Havilland Buffalo, which crashed with the Zambian soccer team, disappeared apparently south of Nigeria. It was over the water. And I don't know too much of the history of that particular case, but if I remember correctly, I think that European search and rescue teams got involved, but there was no search and rescue facility in Nigeria, or for that matter any other Western African country. So I don't think anybody will ever find out what happened to the Zambian soccer team and the Buffalo that crashed into the water.
The training of an air traffic controller. Let's start from the beginning and just explain what process does he go through before he qualifies as an air traffic controller.
Qualifications you need is obviously a matric exemption with maths and science, geography being a recommendation so that you know where everybody's going.
He then actually gets taught the basics, the language, the time, what a flight plan means, which is the front end of an aeroplane. That is a primary course. He then spends a year at a place like Jan Smuts, where he in fact goes through different modules, learning how to be an assistant controller. And that is your first level.
Then the training period is 3 years. On-the-job training, as well as our own courses at our college.
So it's a licensed, subject to rating, subject to validation, subject to ability, subject to space availability.
The question that often arises from the public's perspective is that delays, etc., could be caused by air traffic controllers. Now, the word flow control has been bandied about. What does it entail?
Okay, flow control, in fact, is a very standard procedure which is applied throughout the world. One can imagine that moving air traffic controllers is a voluminous thing. You have a volume of airspace, and here on the reef, in fact, we in fact short of airspace because we're sitting at 5,500 feet above sea level. And you can only fit so many aircraft in that airspace, together with the fact that, of course, you can only speak so many words in a minute. So you end up having to actually control that volume of aircraft in the volume of airspace. It's a matter of management. You'll find that they actually refer to air traffic control often today as air traffic management. You've got to manage it, and the only way you can do that is basically by closing off the flow. The best place to close the flow off, obviously, is when the aircraft's on the ground, because that's the cheapest way of doing it for the airline. You can also close the flow by en route holes. There are various ways of doing it. There are prescribed ways of doing it. At the end of the day, it's to make sure that the airspace is kept safe. In other words, you don't overload that controller. You make sure that the traffic that he handles is within his ability and within the system capacity.
Well, safety being the primary concern there, and we're chatting to the Managing Director of the Air Traffic Navigation Services Company, Mr. Jerry Coetzee. Flow control, a controversial topic, it was brought up there, and the indications are that it's there to provide safety and separation, etc. Is a shortage of personnel not also a problem? Because if you can only handle so much traffic, if you had more personnel, you could possibly handle more.
Well, as Arthur said in his program, if you've got a volume of airspace and you've got separation limitations, let's say 5 nautical miles horizontally and 1,000 feet vertically, you can only handle so many aircraft in that airspace. Yeah. Obviously, we're very concerned, and from the company's viewpoint, our first key value is aviation safety, and we will never compromise on safety. The way you work it, if an air traffic controller can say only handle 30 aircraft an hour, you'll make sure he only handles 30 aircraft an hour. That's where you put aircraft into holding stacks and then feed them from the bottom of the stack for an approach and a landing.
Comparing that to the rest of the situation in Africa, air traffic controllers for countries such as Nigeria, Kenya, etc., were trained in England, European countries and so forth. Why would their standard then be, compared to South African standards, not so high, very low in fact?
I think part of the problem is they trained in a totally wrong environment. They trained in a high-volume environment with the wrong equipment. That's not necessarily required by African countries. I can mention to you now, once again, with the political changes, there's great interest from neighboring countries to have the air traffic controllers trained at our college. And we are, in fact, training neighboring countries' controllers for them. I think we in South Africa got a much better understanding of what their requirements are.
Speaking about the responsibility area that South African air traffic has to cover, it doesn't only stop at the coast. It's more than just the area, the geographical area of South Africa.
Oh yes, much more. What we have is, of course, the whole of South Africa, plus the oceanic regions east and west of the country, which is vast areas we control aircraft in.
What are the possibilities of providing that service further north?
Well, that depends on our neighboring countries. We've adopted an approach that they were quite willing to help them to help themselves.
If we look at the problems associated with, and I say problems in inverted commas, with charging fees for these sort of services. Previously, for instance, it would have cost a general aviation pilot, say, 40, 45, 50 rand to land at what was previously a state airport. Now, once he's been charged his en route fee and his approach fee and his landing fee and so on, that cost could amount to about 150 rand, which is quite a jump in the cost that he has to pay. The argument is, where is that money going and why should I be paying that?
Well, for all the service that they are paying for, it's going back and providing a safe control environment for them and to render service just to them and nobody else.
What we find, though, is that people are moving out of a controlled environment, moving their aeroplanes to uncontrolled airfields and so forth. What are the implications for safety?
Well, obviously, as Arthur indicated there, if you've got airfields underneath a terminal control area, you always have the danger of light aircraft, saying, going into that area and causing a hazard. What's very important, we don't tell these airfields they must have air traffic control. It's the Department of Transport's responsibility to make the regulations as far as safety factors are concerned. And they make the decision, this airfield's located such, it's a safety issue, and then they can, in terms of regulations, enforce whether such an airfield should have air traffic control or not.
Now, with the shortage of personnel, which we've indicated is a problem at the moment, some airfields don't have controllers anymore. I think Pietermaritzburg might be a good example where they've had to curtail their hours of operation and so forth because of a shortage of personnel. What are you doing? Are you actively trying to recruit new people and train them?
Oh yes, we are training people. We've got about 12 in the pipeline at the present moment, which should be in the stream by January, February next year, really making up for the losses we suffered. And we are looking at a course starting next year for an intake of about 16 controllers.
As ons gesels oor die begroting van die navigasiedienste maatskappy, dan praat ons van oor 100 miljoen rand.
Ons praat so by 100 miljoen.
Dus dit is 'n groot klomp geld.
Ja.
Is die maatskappy op spoor wat profijt ensovoorts aan betref? Daar is argumente wat gebruik word dat die projeksies wat gedoen is deur die konsultante aan die begin verkeerd is en dat die inkomstes nie by die verwagtinge uitkom nie.
Nee, ek wil net sê, party van die projeksies was verkeerd. Maar wat verblydend is, dat die totale inkomste is min of meer wat die konsultante voorspel het. So ons kry die nodige inkomste om ons operasionele uitgawes te dek, ons personeeluitgawes en dan ook het ons voorsiening gemaak vir kapitaaluitbreidings. Ek wil net vir jou noem dat ons het nou onlangs tenders uitgesit en ons sal een van die dae die tender toeken vir 'n hele nuwe radar en nuwe vertoonskerms by Durban.
Ja, Durban was een van die plekke wat altyd gekla het oor probleme.
Oor die gebrek aan uitrusting.
Net jy kan sê baie dankie.
Ek sê vir jou baie dankie.
Die lugverkeer en navigasiedienste, die maatskappy en die situasie wat u as die verbruiker in Suid-Afrika kan sien. Ons is binnekort terug met Goeiemôre Suid-Afrika met 'n stukkie musiek.